Good. It seems like an expectant hush has descended exactly on time. So let me welcome you all here. I hope that, can I be heard? There are enough microphones that people, I think, should be audible. My name's Jane Kaplan, and I'm just here to introduce the panel on my left and to moderate the discussion a bit. Professor Friedlander talked yesterday about the development of Holocaust historiography in terms of generations and their relation to the period. And we've got 3 generations here, I think, on the podium. Professor Friedlander, from a generation which, as he said, was initially too close to confront the challenge of writing about this subject. An intermediate generation, of which I'm a representative, who skirted genocide as such, in favour, I would argue, of things that at that time seemed important, but and I think contributed to the way that we've come to understand this history. And perhaps that will figure more in the discussion. And then a third generation, represented by our other 2 panelists, who have initiated and furthered the study of the Holocaust and the study of the war. For those of you who were at Professor Friedlander's lecture, actually it was 2 days ago, will forgive me, I hope, for reintroducing him. I'm sure you've been introduced so many times in your stay here that you barely know who you are. After holding various academic or major academic positions in Israel, he's currently Distinguished Professor of History Emeritus and 1939 Club Chair of Holocaust Studies at the University of California in Los Angeles. He's written very widely on a whole range of issues, on history, on psychoanalysis, on Pope Pius XII, Nazi Germany's foreign relations with the United States, that was in fact his first book, on the future state of Israel, as well, of course, as his work on the Holocaust, which is our subject today, and including, most notably, this magisterial 2-volume study of Nazi Germany and the Jews, of which 1 volume is there to preside over us. And that will no doubt figure prominently in today's discussion. His numerous prizes and awards testify to his preeminent international status as a historian and a historian of Nazi Germany. These include the MacArthur Foundation Award, Pulitzer Prize, the German Geschwister Scholl Prize, and many others. He has a long bibliography of publications since the 1960s, which represent his participation in all the major debates and controversies of Nazi historiography, and his contention with both popular and scholarly ways of addressing that history. He has, I think, a very capacious interest in the question of how this history can possibly be written. And I put equal emphasis on the word how and the word written, the writing. Anyone who was at Hayden White's lecture here a term ago will be able to gauge what lies behind this rather elliptical comment. He has, of course, also addressed, was one of the very first people to address the very problematic question of the historicization of Nazi Germany, with, I realize, looking back over with that material, its very prescient anticipation of Götz Ally's work on the German welfare state. And that will no doubt figure today in this discussion. I think in this book, he has written not just a new history of the topic, but a new kind of history, and a history in which disbelief is sustained as much as disbelief in how it could have happened and what did happen is sustained as much as disbelief in the fact that this event or series of events did happen. Again, I don't want to preempt what my colleagues are going to say. I think this is a historian whose personal history is entwined like a double helix with his scholarly work, but with an ethical self-distancing, which is entirely admirable. The American historian Stephen Aschheim said this in an eloquent tribute to Saul Friedlander in the journal that he founded in 1997, History and Memory. His accomplishment rests upon a rare sublimative capacity to both integrate and yet surmount the fact of his personal experience into subtle historical and cultural scholarship. He is alert as few others are to the nuances separating and joining the personal and the objective realms, childhood memory and dispassionate history, the tactile experiential and the analytic dimensions. If I can make a more banal observation, I think to paraphrase Isaac Deutscher's famous and very rich comment about being a non-Jewish Jew, I would also describe Saul Friedlander as a European non-European. Now, in order of, Saul Friedlander will speak first, and then there will be comments and contributions by my other two colleagues, who I will now introduce in the order in which they will speak. First of all, on my far left, Nick Stargardt, who's Professor of Modern German History at Oxford, a fellow at Magdalen, will be known to many of you here. His research has concentrated on the experience and the critique of war and violence, beginning with a book on pacifism in the late 19th century Germany. And most notably, his rightly celebrated book, Witnesses of War, Children's Lives Under the Nazis. In other words, he's written about Saul Friedlander's childhood, which is a panoramic and hugely evocative study of how children across Europe lived with and around violence. He's currently working on a major new study of German society in the Second World War, and has published early results of this on the effects of the air war, and more generally on Germans in experiencing the war in various different situations. Our other panelist is Mark Roseman, professor in the Department of History at Indiana University in Bloomington, where he holds also the Pat Glaser Chair in the Jewish Studies program. He's a historian of modern Europe with particular interest in the history of the Holocaust and in modern German history, and also a very wide range of publications. He began with work on post-1945 German economic history, but then turned more to the Nazi era. And the book I would single out is his gripping book, which has won multiple prizes, Past in Hiding, which is a biography of a German Jewish woman, Marianne Ellenbogen, who survived underground in Nazi Germany. Also perhaps his volume on the Wannsee Conference, which is a compact masterpiece of narration and interpretation. He's now working on a resistance group in Germany and a broader study of Nazi perpetrators. So we have, in other words, to conclude this, three historians whose lives and works have moved between the macro and micro history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, who have between them mobilized an extraordinarily imaginative range of sources and angles of vision. And those sources, of course, are the dry deposits which the skilled historian can animate in extraordinary ways sometimes. Okay, so if I may ask Professor Friedlander to begin, what we'll do is we'll have, as I say, introductory statements. There'll be some discussion among the panelists, a little bit of to and fro, and then we would hope to throw this open to you, the other participants in this discussion. So, welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Kaplan. I didn't know actually what the topic would be today, so I will start haphazardly, and I hope it will fall in place with the comments and the discussion. I wanted, I think, a few minutes for the starting presentation. I wanted to stress again what I mentioned very briefly in the lecture and maybe not very clearly, the interconnection between various areas of decisions and reactions in what becomes then the final solution, the extermination, but in various ways and at various moments of this history. Let me make it clearer. Of course, in the center, you have Nazi policies, and mentioned 2 days ago this debate about center and periphery, and the thesis of Hans Mommsen, for example, that very often the periphery was determining the decisions of the center. But this is all what happens in that central, let's say, driving area is surrounded by other peripheral areas, but which influence the center and which are not usually mentioned at the same time. That explains, before I even go into the detail, for a moment, why I so much wanted to write an integrated history, because usually one studies the Nazi policies, like Peter Longerich, let's say, in his Politics of Extermination, or most of historians dealing with the Shoah, with the Holocaust, study really Nazi policies. And they say a few words about the surrounding cooperating or non-cooperating authorities or populations, which is a second circle where I would say in each country you have a different situation. And I will give an example later on. And then as an exterior periphery, if you wish, the third circle would be the Jewish reactions. And they are not pure passivity, as is often quickly dismissed. Well, the victims were not part, in a sense, of the historical. They were the objects of that history, but they didn't really interact with the other forces, which again is wrong. And it's only, in my opinion, by considering those, I use the word circle just as a kind of metaphor, but using these various circles, I could add others, but these are the main ones, but not one next to the other. In some books, I think of what's Ian Kershaw's student who wrote on Holland, Bob Moore. Bob Moore's book on Holland, which is a marvelous book, speaks of the Nazi policies and, of course, of the Dutch society and Dutch reactions and Dutch police and so on, and then the victims. I mean, it's a relatively recent book, I would say 10 years approximately. Again, you have this classic division which was started by Hilberg and others, where Hilberg actually put his whole scholarly effort on Nazi policies, and wonderfully, I must repeat that again. I mean, I said it the other evening, it still is the classic analysis of the killing machinery of the Nazi Reich. And then a few comments, very short, on the various countries, and then dismissive comments, as many of you know, about the attitude of the victims, which were really, and which then Hannah Arendt, as many of you know, took over and pushed to an extreme, which has created quite a controversy. But those dismissive comments by Raoul, a friend, late friend, led to a very contentious relation between him and Israeli historiography, or historians, during the until the mid-60s, more or less. So the traditional historiography is a divided historiography. And you see exactly where each person specializes. The history of the Holocaust is one history. What happens in one country is related to what happens in another, and so on. And what happens in one country is related then to the attitude of the authorities. First, it's related to the competition, let's say, to go in the direction of Hans Mommsen, and I would say of Professor Kaplan in 83, during the controversy starting about center and periphery. And it then spills off into the Jewish area and you have reactions which are very far from passivity. Let me give you one example which comes to mind, but the most interesting would be to compare in the West, because in the East, again, it's different. Also, again, if you were concentrating on the major killing area, the Eastern Europe, that is former Poland, right? The general government, the Wartegau, and then into the East, there you would have much less of this interaction for the good reason that the Germans were completely in control and there were no countervailing factors in the extermination policy, or not many, let us say. But if one looks more carefully, one sees that within the German administration, of course, of the death administration, you have competing forces, and again, in that sense, Hans Mommsen was correct. In the general government, as everybody here knows, you had the Hans Frank administration, but you had also the SS, if you wish, and let's say in the Lublin district, you had clashes actually between the two administrations, and the Jews were mostly passive, but not completely. Let us say Cherniakov's policy in Warsaw was very different, and the end was was the same, but in different ways, from what Rumkowski did in Lodz. But think of it for a moment. I mean, one always thinks, well, the Jews had really no influence. As you, again, most of you would know, Rumkowski chose a policy which was, after the war, he was considered the worst of the worst. But if you come to think of it, I would say 2-3 weeks, if but here I can be mistaken, before the Soviets arrived, there were still 60,000 Jews in the Lodz ghetto, because he had chosen that terrible policy of delivering to the Germans all the Jews that could not work. And that was the absolute imperative of working for the Germans, that is, being useful. And he delivered children, he delivered the sick people in the hospitals, and spoke openly to explain his policy to the community, if one may say, in this famous speech in the fall of 1942, when the liquidation, in a way, of the non-working inhabitants of the Lodz ghetto started, that is, to Chelmno. And he succeeded in keeping 60,000 workers in the ghetto until the Soviet army was very nearby. But then, for some strategic reasons, which I must admit I forgot, the Soviets slowed down, not intentionally like in Warsaw, to have the Warsaw Rebellion, the Polish rebellion, crushed by the Germans, and then came into Warsaw. No, that was purely military, and the Germans managed to deport everybody from Lodz to Auschwitz, including Rumkowski himself and his family. So nobody remained except a few hundred Jews. That is, Rumkowski, had the Soviets gone slightly faster, Rumkowski would have been a hero. As happens, he was considered as the worst of the worst. So his policy, whether it was the right policy, horrible term to use for delivering anybody who couldn't work to the Germans, take them first. His policy would have been considered correct with a very slight change. He certainly was not a passive entity, and Cherniakov in Warsaw was not a passive entity. He negotiated. He didn't know with whom he was negotiating, really. It was his mistake, and his last words are well known about the failure of his attempting to save a few youngsters actually from immediate deportation. But now take France, which is maybe, I mean, I know it better than many other countries, but just to illustrate my point, the decisions come from Berlin, but they come to France. The decisions, first, the Vichy government starts with the anti-Jewish policies in France. And that has to be remembered. The Germans did not ask Vichy to start a statute of the Jews. Vichy started on its own. Let's say that's the tradition of the Action Française and so on. Whatever, it's the local French, well-rooted anti-Semitism. And Pétain, which was then, it was argued he was out of this, not at all. He participated in the debates of the government, and the decision to proclaim a statut des Juifs was taken in 3rd of October, I think 1940, just a few months after the defeat. That was one of the great decisions of the French government. Well, there was Montoire. I mean, you see the collaboration policy and dealing with the Jews, so maybe it was a kind of preempt. I mean, it was telling the Germans, look, we are really doing what we can with these common enemies. Well, whatever. Vichy started, and the statute was then reinforced in June of 41, and so on and so forth. And the first camps, as you know, were French camps. That is, and remained so until the ultimate deportation via Drancy to Auschwitz. You had Rivesaltes and Les Milles and whatever, Le Vernet, and a whole series of camps in the southern part of France, first built for Spanish refugees or Spanish from the Republican Army, and then for Jews. I mean, Jews were interned there during the short war and then after the war. And German Jews were deported to those, you remember the deportation of the Jews from Baden-Württemberg to the camps in France. And then from those camps to Drancy, and from Drancy to Auschwitz, all that was under the control of the French police. No Germans there, not in the camps, and not in Drancy until 43. The Germans took over Drancy, the Central Assembly camp, in 43 in order to try to accelerate a deportation which was going down, and that's precisely the point. So the order comes from Berlin, whatever order comes at the beginning, but before that the French had prepared the ground. Now the order goes to 3 or 4 different agencies in Paris. And it goes to Abetz, the ambassador. It goes to one of the Stulpnagels as military commander of France, of the occupied zone. And it goes to the SD, to the Reichssicherheitsamt delegate in Paris, Dannecker and then Röttgen and others. It goes also to the Wirtschaftsstab, to the economic agency. And they, of course, are in a way fighting among themselves in order to implement the orders. But as Herbert Ulrich has shown, Ulrich Herbert has shown, the first orders for clamping down on the Jews in the occupied zones came from the military, not from the SD. The SD was, in a way, waiting. It came from the military, whereas, let's say, just to show that it was different from country to country, in Belgium, the military was really holding back as much as possible, and the SD was pushing. In Holland, of course, again different, because Holland was directly under Nazi party control, Seyss-Inquart and so on, and the SS, well, clashed with him about who was really deciding about policies, but that was like Eastern Europe. So in France, you have those agencies, that's clear and that's known, but then you have Vichy wanting to have its grip on France in Jewish affairs, that is not only on the Vichy zone, but on France as such, so that it tries to, Commissariat aux Affaires Juives in France, that's Vichy, Vallat, and then whatever the name again, you see with age, names suddenly slip my mind, but that's true. Darquier de Pellepoix, and on and on, and Vichy has a grip on the milice, and the milice, of course, replaces the French police when the police starts backing off. So you have Vichy very much influencing the Germans, but mainly Vichy had a major influence when the Germans demanded the denaturalization of French Jews. You see, the deporting or sending off foreign Jews was no problem. And Abetz had seen that German ambassador from the beginning. He said, first, the foreign Jews, because the French are xenophobic and in any case detest those refugees, so start the deportations with them, it will be much easier, and then the French Jews. Well, Vichy didn't play along. They deported, the French police rounded up, and the French trains brought the foreign Jews to Drancy and brought them then from there to Auschwitz. There is a debate which trains brought whom. But then the demand came, and as you know, 89% of these foreign Jews never came back. But then came the French Jews, and there Laval, who actually was the architect of the policy of collaboration, Laval backed off. He said, denaturalizing French Jews, that was the German demand, denaturalize until those who came in 28, and then they would have gone back in time. Laval said no. The war was turning. It was 43. Even Laval understood that things after Stalingrad were not the same. Well, ultimately, the French refused to denaturalize the foreign Jews, the French Jews who were of foreign origin. So the foreign were gone, the French, actually the Israélite Français, of course, the core of the community had hidden in the meantime, and those who had been naturalized but were in France for some time already and spoke French without accent, which was the decisive element, could hide as well. So that then the Germans, you see the interaction, sent a special commando to take now France in hand, Röttke and his acolytes, but they could not. They really tried their best in the meantime occupied zone, but the Jews were fleeing into the Italian occupation zone, which again shows you that the ally was protecting the Jews, as we all know. I mean, until the fall of, until the occupation of Italy by the Germans, the Jews of France and other countries in Yugoslavia, I mean, Serbia and Croatia, were trying to flee, or in Greece, to the Italian zone, and they were safe under Italian protection when the Germans took over. But when the Germans took over, the French police didn't cooperate anymore. So the Germans had to rely on the milice and on their own very limited forces. So you see, here we have the French interaction with the Germans and changing over time from total cooperation in 40, 41 to gradual distancing for reasons which are various. Now the Jews themselves, and that is I would say for me, a difficult thing to debate or even to express, because my argument has been in that book and in lectures that there was no Jewish solidarity. There was a solidarity of smaller groups. I mean, let me say it straight. Throughout and comparatively throughout Europe, the local Jews usually pushed the foreign Jews for deportation, and hoping that they would be saved, although nobody knew exactly what was the end of the process, but for Poland, let's say, for the East. In France, it was absolutely clear, and we have all the documentation. The head of the consistoire, which were the Israélites Français, constantly wrote to Pétain, to Laval, and tried to visit Pétain, whom he knew from World War I, Jacques Heilbronner, and to convince him that there was not the least common ground between the French, Israelites, whose sometimes great-grandfathers had fought with Napoleon, and the new arrivals from Austria, Czechoslovakia, even Poland, and so on. So that the reason why the foreign Jews were the first to be deported and most of them perished is, of course, German policy, no mistake. But then it's also the agreement of the French government, which changed regarding their own Jews, French Jews, and it was the policy, if I may say in quotes, of the consistoire. These refugees bring anti-Semitism, or have brought anti-Semitism. We, the Israelite Français, are something totally different. And you know what? One of the people who condoned this policy was Marc Bloch, the historian, writing several letters on the topic. I once published them. Marc Bloch was also of the opinion, well, he was an Israelite Français. So you have this interaction of the consistoire against the refugee Jews represented by the Fédération des Sociétés Juives de France and so on. And the consistoire, in a sense, succeeded in the end. Now, the French are very proud about the fact that only 50% of the Jews were deported from France. Yeah, but all the foreign Jews were deported, all minus 3–4%. Very few of the French Jews, but also thanks to Italian help. So I don't want to go on, because the interesting thing is, of course, to compare country by country. During the same periods of time, you see, what is happening in France is not what is happening in Holland, is not really what is happening in Belgium, and so you have simultaneous policies, the Germans, the locals, the Jews. In Holland, again, a totally different situation. We may in the discussion come back to it. And of course, Slovakia, and so on and so forth, and Bulgaria, and so on and so forth. So I would say what I attempted to say now is that one has to study this history as one interrelated set of totally different histories. Jewish history in France, Jewish history in Bulgaria, and so on, and policy and histories of French anti-Semitism and so on, and of course the German impetus. But let me end with a remark. I mean, all that looks very functionalist at various levels, the German agency and so on, and the circumstances and so on. But actually it is not, because in the end, of course, changing from country to country, the Reich managed to exterminate a great part of the Jews it wanted to exterminate, so that ultimately, to the very end, yesterday I said that the students 244 and from France, the last trains left Paris 4 days before the Americans entered the city. Ultimately, there is this drang from the center which overrode the others, but you cannot really dismiss the others if you are a historian. It is all tied together.
Thank you very much. I'm almost tempted to call that a special kind of histoire croisée, but let me pass it on to Nick Stargardt.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating, and gives, I think, quite a good sense of why Saul's work has been so influential, and we're still digesting its results, really. And that's what I'd like to start with. I'd like to remind you of a famous public exchange of letters you had in the 1980s with Martin Brožat, because I think it sets up some of the issues at stake. Brožat at that time was the leading German historian of the Third Reich, and he questioned two things. One was whether the final solution was central to the historiography of Nazi Germany, and second, whether the voices of the victims were really relevant. And in an extraordinarily unself-aware assertion, Brožat suggested that Jewish historians were inherently, and in his terms disabling,ly subjective, with true objectivity reserved for German practitioners of his then dominant brand of structuralist history writing. Well, obviously, scholarship hasn't been terribly kind to that view over time, and indeed it's changed, I think, out of all recognition, although that's only 25 years ago or so. I mean, it is really remarkably different, the situation in which we find ourselves. I think also in some ways that exchange may have been an incentive for Saul to write these two extraordinary volumes and to show why the voices of the victims mattered, and also why a structuralist account was not sufficient. And his insistence on multiple layers of interpretation and his juxtaposition of many vantage points and voices has profoundly influenced successive cohorts of historians, as Jane set us out, including, I would like to confess, me. Now, in this second volume that we're looking at in front of us, Saul achieves the narrative feat of integrating perpetrators and victims, critics and bystanders within his history by adopting the structure of a chronicle, unfolding it at 6 months at a time. And that allows him to do what he was setting out here, which is to hold in tension what are potentially incompatible themes and incompatible views of reality, but are simultaneously present. And what it also does, I think, quite profoundly, is to shift the balance from the instigation, from the origins of policymaking, the origins of decision-making, to what it means to carry it out in practice and what its social impact is across the whole of Europe. And this, as he was setting out here, means that we go far beyond the Nazi and the German elites and start looking at all of the elites of occupied Europe, those that were in positions of functional or administrative power and therefore collaborated, almost always using some version of the lesser evil argument. I mean, the point of thinking about Chaim Bunkowski or the leaders like Jakob Gens of the Wilna Ghetto is to think about their choiceless choices, the ways in which to act as a shield, the way that Pétain claimed, of course, that he was a shield to the French. They claimed that they were a shield in their little ways to their local Jews. They were always trying to carry out the lesser evil. The German military, no doubt, thought that it was preempting what the SD would do if it could get into France, and so protecting the French from an even worse German agency than themselves. And so part of the irony of the story, as one widens the cast, is that everybody is trading Jews as some kind of symbolic currency to ward off a greater evil which will afflict them if somehow the Jews are not deported. And that's the story, not really of working towards the Führer, which one might describe in Nazi cases, but of a European-wide network and web where the only way you can satisfy this driving demand from the center is to satisfy their central ambitions, which are to have Jews, in the hope that you can then negotiate down the numbers of forced laborers or the food quotas or some other good that the Germans also want out of you. And so it's not only a demythologizing story which strips away all of the alibis which Europeans told themselves through the 50s, 60s, and 70s about acts of heroic or, at best, spiritual resistance. it's also one which asks troubling questions about the contamination of European culture and, in a spiritual sense, the churches through their studied and quite resolute silence in public on the final solution. And again, they would have argued that they were trying to defend their own. But the definition, as Saul pointed out on Monday when somebody asked about the churches after his lecture, of who their own is, of course, keeps dwindling as they exclude all baptized Jews. Now, I think that this is quite a profound shift of focus, because both at the level of high-level policy making, that was the underpinning of the intentionist functionist debate, or if you think about the debate between Browning and Goldhagen in the 1990s, the focus for a long time has been on the decision to commit murder, whether it's on high or at the realm of ordinary reserve policemen and ordinary soldiers. And what Saul has done is to bring in the trickling through of knowledge, the trickling through of collusive, contaminating activity through this slow unfolding of a chronicle. And the importance of a chronicle is, of course, the importance of time. And by looking at it at 6 months and using the voices of diarists as his witnesses, as his markers of time passing, it brings back to us how long the Holocaust was, how long the Second World War went on for, how people are completely conflicted, as Jane, I think, was indicating at the very beginning, between what they know is happening and their inability to assimilate the knowledge. Now, I could go on about this at some length. I'm aware that I'm only meant to talk for about 10 minutes. So I'd like to bring this together to think about two different questions. One is that it is an incredibly restrained as well as very powerful account. It's an account which creates its narrative symmetry through two different kinds of voices. There's the driving, ranting voice of the Führer, and it's counterbalanced by the rational, quiet voices of the victims. His Jewish diarists are almost always calm, rational, and reflective. And he was very careful, I think, not to use memoir material so as to avoid the dangers of hindsight and the distortions of perspective when a whole world with its value systems has collapsed, or the desire to paint a better picture of oneself afterwards, which we all suffer from. And yet at the same time, of course, he's the most self-knowing of historians, who, is it about 35 years ago, when I was in my teens, he wrote a memoir.
Yes.
And it's an extraordinary memoir, When Memory Comes, because it explores what it is to write an autobiography. It locates it very concretely in place, in a context, which was Israel after the Yom Kippur War, after the 1973 war. And it tells the story of Friedlander's childhood, his being placed by his Czech Jewish parents in a French convent school run by an ultramontanist order, and he was given the pseudonym of Paul-Henri Ferland, and there he stayed.
Paul-Henri Marie Ferland.
Pardon. And there he stayed, and he didn't learn what had happened to his absent parents until, I think, about 18 months after liberation. And when he was told by a broad-minded Jesuit, he reverted to his original name and emigrated to Israel. I think nobody could have told, and certainly not Paul, or as he now became Saul, that he would become a historian, let alone the historian of the Holocaust. But I think what was foreseeable from that moment onwards was that he would need to know. He would need to know what happened. And I think it's this quality which marks your work out amongst your peers, really, which is most historians of the Holocaust are content with trying to establish the very complex relationships between ideologies, policies, and killings, the contours of what one might call the external causal history of the Holocaust. you, I think, have always wanted to know what it meant in human terms as well. And this leads me to my first question, which is, that memoir was written 35 years ago, and of course, our lives don't end. And I wondered what it would mean if you were going to write a memoir now. How would you write about your childhood in any way that was different? Has the passage of the last 2 years changed things? The second thing I wanted to broach is really one for all of us, and I'll try to express it very briefly, which is difficult because it's what I'm interested in at the moment, and that is, Saul mentioned in passing in his lecture on Monday the issue of knowledge, of what it meant during the war, during the Holocaust, for people to know that this was happening and for them to know across Europe. And of course, there's no place where the burden and the moral freight of that knowledge was more relevant than in Germany itself. Of course, knowledge doesn't tell us in itself what meanings are ascribed to it. And we have a great deal of information that's been amassed by historians over the last few decades to show, whether it's from personal letters and diaries or from local SD reports, security police, reports on public opinion, that people did know and they did talk about the killing of the Jews. There's a mass eruption of this kind of talk in the summer and autumn of 1943, in the wake of the firebombing of Hamburg, the Hamburg firestorm, which spreads a sense of panic, and there's about a 6-week period where the Nazi regime itself feels as if it is under very grave threat and holds off from any kind of repression, and then they clamp down in September. So there's a period from July through to September 1943 where there's talk of all kinds on the squares and shop queues of German society, and one of the repeated refrains is a kind of inversion of Goebbels' propaganda motif, where he's been drilling into people through the previous 6 months that the Jews were out to annihilate Germans and that they have to take defensive measures against them, or indeed sometimes the press admits that they have taken defensive measures against them already and annihilated them. I mean, it trickles through. But what people say is something rather different in this context. What they say is a kind of wish fulfillment or wishful thinking. It's, if only we hadn't acted against the Jews, now we wouldn't be being punished for it. We are now suffering the Jewish retaliation through the Allied bombing. And this is clearly one of those things which is critical of the regime, and the regime certainly doesn't like it, but which is steeped in a kind of frame of meaning which is impossible to understand without peeling off layers of the Goebbels media machine, that people see things in terms of a world Jewish threat, which is somehow linked to Allied bombing. They remember that they were promised retaliation against the British, but this hasn't happened, so it's now being done to them as a kind of inversion. It's Jewish retaliation against the Germans. And of course, the very impossibility of formulating a wish admits that this is an event in the past. The height of the final solution was actually already a year, 18 months before this. It's a public, involuntary conversation about something which now lies in the past and is affecting their present and future expectations. And so I suppose it was the puzzle of this kind of decoding of knowledge, what meaning we should give it, which made me realize we can't possibly do this for Germany without thinking about what frame of meaning did they give to the war. That for them, the Holocaust is not the central event. For them, the war is. This is a solipsistic discussion. This is about the fate of Germans. It's not really about Jews. It's about Germans in the wake of Allied bombing. And it's about their expectations of their immediate future. So just to say, Saul has influenced both of my works in this area. First, as Jane pointed out, I wrote about children's experience of the Second World War and the final solution, and the link is all too obvious. And I'm currently trying to understand how German society experienced the war, and my starting point was the puzzle of how they made sense of the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Without delay, if I can just hand over to Mark.
All right. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and a real honor to be sitting next to Saul Friedlander, who's been influential in so many ways, not just with this marvelous volume. Also, I'd like to commend the first volume that came out 10 years earlier with its wonderfully subtle exploration of how policy moves forwards in the 1930s. And in fact, I want to come back to that in a moment. And also, more broadly, for Saul's extraordinary self-reflexiveness, not just in the wonderful memoir that Nick has already mentioned, but also I'd like a moment that really, I remember, struck me years ago. It's in a volume that came out in 1985, where a group of largely German historians were debating the exact moment at which a decision might have arisen for the origins of the final solution. I don't remember the exact words, but there's a point at which you're kind of talking their words back to them, and you say, that okay, we look at it, we make a statement like that so-and-so went to Belchitz in such and such a month, and then begins gassing, and that there's no other history, there's no other historiography where you can say a sentence like that, and it was just a brilliant moment because it suddenly made you step back, or certainly as a reader, reflect, what is this causal process that we're trying to uncover? But it doesn't release us from the dilemma of the causal process. And my starting point was your end point, because that on the one hand you're saying, we have to approach this in a disaggregated way. We have to be aware how many different systems are involved. We have to be conscious of how different the different national contexts are. We have to have a sense that there are different agents and different participants, and they come with their own motives and their own scope for action and so on. And at the same time, and yet, in all these different contexts, it's extraordinary how far this murderous impulse was able to be carried through. So the question I came in, obviously I didn't know what you were going to say in advance, but the question that I came in with is, we have this marvelous narrative, and you consciously chose the narrative form because you eschewed monocausal explanations. What do we do next? And I was just going to name some of the monocausal explanations it seems to me that you've so effectively knocked down. And first of all, I was very struck by the fact that, and I think also very impressive, you hardly use the word Holocaust. If one looks at the index, you can see that you use it in the preface because it's become now the convenient label by which one describes the phenomenon. But in fact, what you draw our attention to is that, in a way, it's created an overly focused and cohesive sense of a phenomenon that, in fact, takes all sorts of forms. Yes, an underlying presumption that killing would be a desirable solution, but with varying degrees of intensity, with recognitions of certain constraints, with need for labor here and diplomatic considerations there, and so on. So this carefulness and this disaggregation is a spectacular achievement. You've toppled, I think, very successfully the idea that the Holocaust can be diagnosed as a symptom of modernity, because you bring out the balance between rationality and irrationality. You show that it's not simply a technological phenomenon, that often it was carried through by very primitive means. It's certainly not simply a streamlined or rationalized phenomenon. You bring out the role of traditions, ideological traditions, social traditions in making it possible. And also one could add, I think, the specificity of the constellation in the interwar period. In other words, if this is modern, it's a very different modern from the modern that you had before 1914. I think that you demolish the idea that we can simply see this a function of race. You show that anti-Semitism can never be reduced to racial thinking. You bring out the religious, the millenarian elements in anti-Semitism. You show that for Hitler, the threat that Jews posed was always as much about a global conspiracy, a notion of a conspiracy or a kind of army or a political grouping as much as it was something that you could identify in the blood. And in the first volume, you brought out brilliantly the ways in which it took actually a long time for elements of racial thinking, eugenics thinking, and so on, and the propagators of those ideas and the institutions and bodies that were involved there, actually to fuse together so that the agenda takes on a cohesiveness. I think, I mean, implicitly, I think there are probably places also explicitly you demolish the idea that it's a kind of successor, which has sort of been quite fashionable recently, that it can be somehow subsumed under the notion of empire, either that murderous anti-Semitism is somehow a legacy of earlier imperialisms, with what I've already said about the way that you talk about the intellectual traditions and the way that anti-Semitism can't be subsumed under the notion of race, deals with that. You've shown that it can't be seen simply as a kind of instrumental tool to achieve colonial settlement objectives. And above all, you've brought out the ways in which it's, if you like, it starts nationally and it ends globally. What it isn't is imperial. What struck me, though, with thinking when you were talking about the role of the French and the Slovaks and so on, is that in one sense it is the most imperial of all genocides. And I think it's the only genocide that's carried out throughout an empire. In other words, it's not dealing with a particular regional context, but it's having to deal with these different levels and these different relationships and the different degrees of autonomy all across an entire empire. In that sense, it's the most imperial of genocides, but it can't be reduced to some notion of empire. Okay, so where do we go? Where do we go back to get this singular sense of purpose despite all the variations? So that's my question to you. And I wondered, I hesitate to mention Tim Snyder's work, since after Richard Evans' review there's not that much left of it, but at least he's reminded us of the degrees of violence that was taking place on the other side of the Nazi-Soviet divide, if he hasn't given us that much of an explanation. And I wondered whether or not something that your work leaves open, and then I'm thinking particularly going back to the first volume of the 2 volumes, is some modified notion of totalitarianism. I don't mean a simplified notion of people simply doing what they're told. I don't mean the idea of people simply acting in fear, although again I think one of Richard Evans' achievements has been to bring back a little bit the place of terror, where there's perhaps been an overemphasis on a dictatorship of consensus. But I mean that whatever the building blocks and instruments which were available, your narrative perhaps leaves open the possibility of emphasizing the way in which a peculiar political system has an extraordinary transformative power, which, as long as that system is in existence, enables ideas, motives, and so on, which would have nothing of this destructiveness to gain a murderous force. And I'm struck, so often by the speed with which the killing stops. You said that in France that it's amazing that it goes on till 4 days before the France the deportations. Sorry, before 4 days, and it's amazing when one looks at the death marches and so on. The killings in Nazi Germany go up right to the last minute, but then they stop. I mean, there are some murderous, some eugenic influence murders of patients in Kaufbeuren Hospital, which go on a little bit after the end of the war, but the fears of the werewolves and the fears that continued that the Allies had largely don't continue. And I wondered if that's the way in which to construct some sense of unity from this disaggregated. It's just some way of thinking about a modified version of the ability of a political system to transform and give murderous potential to ideas which are present, but which don't have don't have that quality without the mobilizing potential of this relationship between a leadership and followers, mass party, and the other ingredients of this system. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much. We have about now half an hour, so what I would suggest is that, well, I don't know if you'd like to, some direct questions have been offered to you, or would you?
It would be better, yeah, to have. Because
okay, that's very generous of you.
Otherwise, we would be here until.
I wish we could stay longer. I'm sure we could. I mean, we can't logistically speaking.
Yeah.
I'm sure we could intellectually speaking. Okay, so I mean, the one thing I would add to this is while people are collecting their thoughts, is that the discussion so far has remained pretty much at the level of the empirical and the interpretive, and the whole issue, which I think is raised in your book, and which you touched on a little yesterday, which is about the familiarization and defamiliarization, has perhaps not been articulated. How to sustain disbelief in the process of telling a story. Mm-hmm. So I would just add that as an additional dimension. But please let me ask for comments. Peter Pulitzer. You'll have to speak loudly because there are many people behind you.
Right, okay, I will try to be audible. But this may not be to the benefit of those present. I'd like to raise a point which spans the generations of interpretation. A question which was asked right at the beginning and is still asked in Saul Friedlander's book, and will no doubt will continue to be asked, which is what triggered the finality of the final solution? What is it that made the Holocaust a genocide that was not just a series of massacres? And one of the phrases that you use, which I think is very important for the understanding of this process, is that Jews appeared or were painted as a meta-historical enemy. But my question is, for whom were they the meta-historical enemy? For the instigators, certainly, because there were any number of other ways in which Jews could be exploited or discriminated against or persecuted without killing them. More profitable ways of doing so. So unless there was this irrational obsession, the final solution could not have taken the form that it did. But how far down does this go? Irrespective of whether one thinks in terms of the center influencing, the periphery influencing the center, or the center being a command structure that can exact obedience. And on this I'm rather more skeptical, because although the Holocaust was not yet another colonial war, it was not yet another bit of imperialism, colonial wars bring in their way all kinds of atrocities. They may not be genocidal, but they are nevertheless quite terrible. And if you ask yourself what kind of person participated, what kind of ordinary uniform recruit participated in the atrocities, shall we say, of the Algerian War, or of some British colonial wars, or of Belgium or German or Portuguese colonial wars, I suspect these people didn't have much of an ideological motivation and didn't feel much moral compunction about torturing or killing those whom they were told were an enemy, or a danger, or a menace. And I wonder to what extent this doesn't, the meta-historical enemy diminishes as a driving force the lower down we go. I don't want to drag up Hannah Arendt's banality of evil cliche yet again. I mean, we all know that Eichmann was anything but banal. He was a driven instigator. But maybe those who fired the triggers at Babylon, even those who kicked Jews into gas chambers, didn't really think what they were doing.
Should I
Yes,
answer?
I think you should, yes. And people can also just keep their hands raised so I can figure out who wants to speak.
I mean, Professor Pulitzer asked a very complex series of questions. I will start with the end, which I think is leading to the central issue. I mean, what you say is I would say you are adopting Christopher Browning's ordinary man theory of anybody, including him, he writes in the preface, I think, to the first edition of Ordinary Man. Even he, in conditions like that, would be able to kill, which I doubt, but in any case, that's your question. No great ideology, and well, I think, of course, you are right. In Algeria, which I, as anybody living in France, followed very closely, and anywhere else historically, and present cases, one sees that ordinary people are non-ideological people. When they start getting into the act of killing, can do it very easily. But if you take the case of ordinary men and look at what they said at their trials in the 60s, if I'm not mistaken, the members of the battalion were brought to court. And it's on that material that Browning and Goldhagen and so on wrote their studies. There is something which has been missed by most readers. The third part of their operations is looking for Jews in the forests in the winter, I think, of 42-43, or maybe I'm mistaken, in 43, in the forests. Jews are hiding, and one of the last operations of the Battalion 101 is to hunt them and to find them. And they describe it. And they say, well, so the judge or whoever asked them, so how did you recognize that these were Jews? I mean, if you see a kid or a woman, even a man walking, hiding, and you had others hiding. They said, well, they were dirty, the face, and so on. I mean, I don't remember all the adjectives they used, but they were unconsciously, during their trial in the 60s, repeating the stereotypical images of the Jew which had been common in the Reich. That is, they were not ideologists. Most of them couldn't care less about eugenics or racial ideology. But they had an image which had been instilled, I would say, before. They were elder people, they went to school maybe under Weimar and so on, or during World War I. They were not socialized in the Third Reich, but they were influenced by daily propaganda, mixing all the themes of the image of the Jew. I mean, the complexity of the image, in my opinion, has never been really analyzed. That is, Yud Zeus in the film is one thing. Ahasuerus is another thing, and some of you may know that in the last great 30th of January speech that Hitler gave, 44, he spoke not of the Jewish microbe, which according to some historians, I mean, anti-Semitism moved from the religious image to the Jewish microbe to biology. Not at all. He came back to Purim, the so-called killing by the Jews of their enemies. He spoke of Ahasuerus. If you look at the January 44 speech to the non-existent Reichstag, Hitler spoke actually in terms of religious mythology about the Jew. So you have that. You have, of course, the biological vision. You have mainly the face reproduced everywhere of a not only ugly face, but threatening face. And if you look at the Yod or Juif or Jude written in the yellow tag, you notice that it's written in characters which look Hebrew, but are, of course, readable by anybody, but are threatening characters. I mean, I think if one analyzes the writing within the image already of the yellow star, you see that it means to say it's a special kind of danger, you know, it's really scary. I think somebody, and I don't know who, must have spent a lot of time to figure out the font, if I may say, of this star. But it means to say there is something there that comes, it comes from far away. These are Hebrew characters, you know, Hebrew. That goes into the primeval dangers, which we all know from the catechism and so on. And it indicates then implicitly these people have to be eliminated, which brings me very quickly to your first part of the question. When did it become imperative in a way, right? When did the final solution become final? For whom? For Hitler, of course. In that case, we don't know, of course, exactly about the when, but that's really irrelevant. If it's October or December 41, it's 41. Well, I think that there was a logic in that absolute folly, and that was that the Jews being a danger, and Hitler constantly came back to the example of World War I, and my student Burin wrote about it very, I think, beautifully, Philippe Burin, the influence of the defeat of 1918, 1917-18, the revolution and so on, the Jews, of course, the stab in the back and so on. Hitler constantly repeated, 1918 will not happen again. So that, and what he said already in January 1939, but still in a general way, if the Jews bring again a world war, not the Aryan people and so on will be destroyed, but the Jews will be exterminated. And that was considered as also a threat to American Jews in that conjuncture, but never mind. When the war became, I mean, Hitler tried a few other options, leading to a more prolonged death. The geographical plans, I mean, the territorial plans, Lublin and then Madagascar and then northern Russia, but it failed each time because of the war situation. And then the US entered the war, and Japan, the US, the war becomes the total war, which he had in a way feared from the beginning. Eastern Front, the Russians counterattack. The Americans are now in. It will take time, but they are there. Then this enemy, this internal enemy which brought our defeat in the first total war, the Great War, has to be eradicated, as he said to Himmler on December 17th, 1941, ausrotten. So that this becomes final in sometime at the end of 41. But in order to become final, you have to have the image of the enemy. And this image of the enemy is in Hitler's mind, of course, but it goes down, as we notice in the testimonies of the members of Battalion 101. It goes very deep down. These people are dangerous, or they are ugly. There is something, and you know better than many, because of your studies of the rise of anti-Semitism in Germany and Austria, how all this was actually a mixed image of intellectual desiccation, let's say, the Jews, pure intellect, but as Goebbels said, the intellect of a dangerous beast, and so on and so forth. So, in my opinion, it sickened down into the depths of the general psyche, if one may speak of that, via Christianity, via whatever currents coming together. And of course, in Hitler's mind, this was a strategic, real, warlike danger, and became final.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, because in my mind it doesn't really make sense to me how, even with all the old hatreds and the anti-Semitism and all the new pseudo-scientific theories like eugenics, how they all, and even in my mind, even all of them together don't add up.
You think that they can come together?
No, I do think that they can come together, but I don't think they can add up to the devastation in the way they did. And what was the extra added ingredient, the destructive influence upon the Nazi regime that has led them to this travesty?
Well, travesty is maybe not the right word. They could or could not come together, but strangely enough, I mean, you have these images at the top, you have them in the simple minds, let's say, of the general population. I don't mean to be in any way negative, but let's put it that way. And then in the middle level of really extraordinarily able technological geniuses almost. Hans Kammler in Auschwitz, and I mean, the great technological mind of the German Luftwaffe, who also was in charge of the gas chambers. You see an absolutely convinced, fanatical Nazi, believing in all those images, although he was a highly competent, more than that, SS technological master. And you find that in all the mid-level, in many of the mid-level, forget Hitler, this had gone down to the mid-level of Nazi technology and so on. Mengele is, of course, another example, and so on. That is, you have the top, you have the mid-level, which we do not always remember, and you have this strange sense of danger, of unease, of hostility among the population, and all that together may not be enough at the down level for the motivation that has to come from the, but it's enough not to create a countervailing force. It's enough to say, at best, we don't interfere with that.
But if I can interject here, I think that question actually does emerge in some senses, or it links to the point that you make in your introduction, that you want to offer this the historical study, which is what we've been talking about so far. But as you say, without eliminating or domesticating that initial sense of disbelief. And in some senses, that's the sense of disbelief that it isn't very difficult for us to sustain, because it's there. And so I'm interested in the way that you respond with the explanation.
Yes.
And I'd like to know how we can validate, or what we can do with that sense of disbelief.
It has been following me like a nemesis.
I'm sorry.
Wherever I go, how do you really manage to give a thorough historical presentation, description, or whatever, and keep that sense of disbelief, or at least moments of disbelief? As I said very consciously in the introduction, well, I think this is feasible without leaving the domain of the historian. It did bother me from the beginning that our historical works often, the literature, the historical literature on the extermination of the Jews often came down to textbook level. It's very important, but event after event, correlation and so on, and at the end you understand perfectly well how it went from face to face, which it did. Of course it did. But it was much more. And there are moments there where you think, I can't believe it, let's say that's the expression. And then, oh, yes, A, B, C, D. So I tried, because I feel that way, that I tried to show that you could explain really as well as documents allow us to explain, and at the same time, from time to time, tell the reader and tell myself, you know, what I'm describing here, like this, there is this diary of a girl in Stanislavov who writes, and she will be murdered 2 weeks later. But she writes, I hope that she speaks of a girlfriend of hers, they are all 18 or something, and she says, I hope she died quickly and not like Esterke, who was seen being strangled during the killings in the cemetery of Stanislavov, 17,000 or so, in 2 batches. Incidentally, the diary was found in a ditch then by a Polish peasant who kept it. Now, what I did, and it may work or not, is not to use my own voice, of course, to say, no, that would be terrible, but to use historical material, the diaries, the voices of the victims and of the perpetrators, but mainly the victims, and the reader can put together the voice of the German soldiers saying the Jews are coming here 7,000 to 8,000 per week to Auschwitz. He speaks from the town of Auschwitz on the way to the Eastern Front. And the dire hero's death, ein Heldentod. It's wonderful to see the word he adds. You keep that in mind, and then you have the diary of that young woman from Stanislavov, speaking of her friend being strangled during the action. And this creates, I think, in the reader's mind, whether you want it or not, because that's the reality. And these diaries are real. They are diaries of people who then disappear. They are not rewritten memoirs. You see, that's why I really avoided as much as possible memoirs. Also, I had written one myself, but I knew that it was influenced by what one learned and so on and so forth. The diaries are immediate cries and whispers, I would say, of people, and they are not as rational, Nick, as you said. The voices of our victims are often completely, they are taken aback. They don't know what they are seeing. They don't believe, mainly. And that explains the smoothness of the process, which has been explained in many ways because of German technological, logistic abilities, and also the deceit which was brought to the very end, to the gas chambers, as you know. Some members of the SS and some members of the Jewish Sonderkommando entered the gas chambers saying, "Now, don't worry, your shoes has been well tied so that you would find both shoes when you get out." And then would at the last moment leave, doors close and the gas comes in. So that it was, all that was perfectly well organized. But it is the victims show in those voices that they cannot believe really what's going on. Do I have half a second more? Because I want to give one example. Yeah. And I want to quote the diary of Hélène Baird, who is a French diarist. She published it, unfortunately, she published it. Her family gave it to the Centre de Documentation in Paris 1 or 2 years ago. So I didn't know of it when I wrote this book. But she's a very well-educated agrégé, studying for agrégation, which in France is a very high academic course. In American literature, actually. She speaks of it in her diary. She is from a very wealthy family. And at the beginning, she doesn't understand anything of what's going on. And then she works at the Hôpital Rothschild, which was the only, of course, hospital where Jews could be treated. And she writes in the end of 43 or even early 44, I mean, very late in the war. She says, yesterday they took 40 of my patients. She works, she's not a physician, she works. One woman who is about to give birth, a man completely paralyzed in the face, and she goes on, she gives examples of the people they took, one woman with a drain in the belly. She says, these people are sent to work. They will die on the way. That is, even late 43, I think, Ellen Baer, highly educated, highly knowledgeable in a way, cannot believe that they are taking these people for work. How could they work? They will perish in the train. But not imagining why these people are taken and where they are being sent. So, I mean, that was my way of creating the disbelief, the voices of disbelief, but historical voices, historical documents inserted in a narrative which goes on and on of the events and their interconnections.
Do either of the panelists want to say anything here? No? Well, I think we have time for one more comment or question from the... No one brave enough after that very moving point. But I think that is one of the reasons why this is such a uniquely painful as well as revealing book. And I've had that experience with many of my colleagues who've read it, who feel like they're reading this history for the first time or in some seriously different way. Well, I would not have wished to have the last word, but it's inevitable that the chair does, I'm afraid. But we have, of course, only scratched the surface of the topic and indeed of Professor Friedlander's work. But I would like to thank you for revisiting this for us specifically in this room today, and also the other panelists for their contributions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you.